Welcome everyone. Today's author talk is part of the Swan Hill Regional Library's Swan Hill Remembers project. The project was supported by the Victorian Government and commemorates the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Our special guest today is author Mike Rosel. Mike is a retired, or perhaps I should say semi-retired, writer living in Melbourne. During his career, Mike served as a public affairs officer at the Washington Embassy and the Australian High Commission, London. For 6 years, he was also the National Public Relations Officer for the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. Mike has decades of feature writing and often photography for government publications, university and travel magazines under his belt, including writing the House Journal of the Bureau of Meteorology, feature articles for Qantas In-Flight magazine, and frequent tourism and history contributions to Royal Auto magazine. In 2012, Mike published the first biography of Australia's greatest fighter ace, Captain Alec Little. The book is called Unknown Warrior: The Search for Australia's Greatest Ace. Most recently, Mike has honoured his father's World War II experience in his book titled A Rat of Tobruk, A Digger's Lost Images of the Siege. The book tells the story of Military Cross recipient Lieutenant John Rosel and the 2nd 24th Battalion's journey from training in northeast Victoria to the desert of Tobruk. It includes some of the 600 plus photos Lieutenant Rosel took during his time at war and excerpts from some of the 181 never before published intimate and frank letters from Tobruk by Private Harry Fraser to his parents in Swan Hill. Historian Dr. Mark Johnson wrote about the book. Lieutenant John Rosel won a Military Cross for displaying calmness and outstanding leadership when his platoon became surrounded at a critical point in the siege of Tobruk. He led the defence of several vital outposts against numerous attacks by the troops of General Rommel. His son Mike has written not only a touching tribute to his father's war service, but also a perceptive and stylish account of the soldiering experience of a generation. Thanks very much for speaking with me today, Mike, and congratulations on the release of your book. Sadly, the onset of COVID-19 put plans to launch your book on Anzac Day this year on hold. Do you have any plans to try again next year on the 80th anniversary of the siege?
Kelly, I think the launch is dead, but I am working with some of the commemorative people to share in the various events that will be held for the 80th. So the images they'll be seen again. Thank you.
Which is lovely. So they should be. It's a shame we missed out, but COVID's upsetting everything, isn't it, really?
That's right.
Mike, your book holds a special interest to our community as Harry Fraser was a local to Swan Hill. His family owned a well-known business, Fraser and Horn Hardware, for many years. Harry returned to the business after coming home from the war. Harry took over. Now, did Harry take over from his father? I'm not sure on his retirement, but he certainly worked at the business.
I don't know whether he literally took over, but I understand he worked with them until he moved to Benalla in about 1958.
There we go. So how did you discover Harry Fraser's letters, and what do you think his letters brought to the book?
Well, when I got a rush commission to try and do the book, I had the photographs, and they had on the back of many of them little handwritten notes from my father, excuse me, to my mother, and they were invaluable, but not that much. But I didn't have any diaries, none of the letters he'd written back to Melbourne to his girlfriend Lorna, my future mother. So I went looking for someone who could flesh out the photographs to tell the story from the digger's perspective. We had the battalion history, which was terrific. I went to the War Memorial where I'd been before for the earlier book, and they pulled out about 6 or 8 folders of material from Dad's battalion. And against the clock one day, I madly went through all these, nothing. And then all of a sudden, here are these 181 letters, thank God in chronology, from Harry Fraser, of his whole wartime experience. And I madly went to May 1941 and discovered that, okay, he had been in the front line. And I was photographing madly, realising that here was the man who could be the witness, for all of them. And that wasn't serendipitous enough. About 20 minutes in, I discovered one where he was in my father's platoon. 30 men, my father was the platoon leader, and Harry Fraser, a bandsman turned rifleman, was in his platoon in the middle of the worst fighting, which was remarkable to me.
Yes.
And of course, the letters at all sorts of levels spoke for the common experience of the guys who went through that 8-month siege. He would speak about being scared. He'd speak about the dreadful food. He said a Mallee sandstorm was child's play compared to the desert storms. He was no poet, but he wrote honestly to his parents, which didn't always happen in those days. And of course, there he was. There was the ordinary digger, a guy from the bush, or Swan Hill may not be the bush, but in Australia, talking about what was virtually common to all of them.
No, I think the letters are very picturesque, if you like, in the way that they paint a picture of what actually was happening there at the time and how Harry was experiencing the war. I think it gives a great picture or a great insight into what was happening at the time. And I wonder, would you be so kind as to read us perhaps a passage from the book?
Sure. Remember, Harry was quite religious.
Yes.
When he thanked God for helping him, he really meant he thanked God. He was really quite down of faith. So this passage, against that background, is particularly telling. He's saying, this war is a rotten business and has taken some bonzer chaps that I know and you know, but I must try and keep off that line. I'm glad to have the opportunity to hear Mass tomorrow for the first time in 6 weeks. The best I'm able to do is read my missal each Sunday, and believe me, I've read it in some queer places. One Sunday perched behind a machine gun, ready to pour lead into the first Hun who showed his head, which really is not a very edifying mixture. But duty is duty, is it not? And I feel now, after some of the things I've seen and heard about the German, by that I mean the leaders, not the poor unfortunate private soldier who doesn't want the war any more than I do and is only acting under orders. And he goes on to say he feels we're fighting for our freedom and self-respect. So in other words, he could separate the sins of the German leaders from the deeds of the poor men they sent out to die on their behalf, which is fairly mature.
Yes, it is for a young man, isn't it, to have that insight? Okay. I must admit that after reading your book, I realised that I had no idea just how underarmed, under-equipped and outmanned the 2nd 24th Battalion was when facing Rommel's troops. I can't imagine how terrifying that must have been. However, your father, at just 24 years of age, at the height of the battle, held his nerve and under extreme pressure and sent a very succinct field report to headquarters asking for reinforcements. that report has been documented many times and is a very interesting piece of writing. A lot of soldiers didn't talk about their experience at the war. Your father was one of them. Did the process of writing the book give you a greater understanding of what your father experienced during that time, and what impact do you think it had on him?
The fact that he wouldn't talk about combat from the first time I asked him as a very young child, I was the oldest, right through his life, you know, the odd occasional intimate moment, we might be driving to Swan Hill or something, you know, you'd raise these things, but he'd always evade it gently. That, from an early age, got me reading all about things military. I rapidly understood that very few combat survivors would talk about it, particularly with their family, for all sorts of reasons, most of which are pretty well known. So I wasn't surprised with that, and in the research, I didn't discover anything new on that sort of vein. I was not able to tell whether he, you know, he was terrified, scared, stoic, or like some of them, loved it. You know, we got to remember that this was the greatest moment of some men's lives, and you know, there were those who exulted in battle, which you don't like to think about. But so I was never to find out any more about his reactions. Post-war, he was a terrific father. He really was, and he never spoke against war. He was quite happy to have us in school cadets and make sure we polished everything. To my knowledge, I don't think he ever went to an RSL or even Anzac Day. He certainly wasn't a heavy drinker like some of them. And I was never conscious of anything we would call post-traumatic stress. Of course, that generation didn't let on anyway, but of course, having raised 6 kids and then losing my mother when she was only 44 and then mercifully remarrying, and it was pretty busy. I don't think he had time to worry about himself. So I didn't advance any further in my understanding of what it meant to him personally. So.
Yes, it is difficult to try and understand, really, and I don't think unless you were there that, you know, we can really grasp what happened to them, can we? But anyway, so do you think your father not talking about the war as he did had, you know, an impact on you, or just piqued that curiosity?
Well, it piqued the curiosity, which has been a lifetime interest in military history. There's, you know, it's the worst thing that's ever come on the human race, isn't it?
It is.
And I think, as I said in another arena, you don't know the pressure on people raised very strongly religiously, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill. And all of a sudden you're told, well, hang on, wait that one, you've got a job to do. What that does to particularly the sensitive people, you know, well, we now know it's likely to give them problems for much of their lives. But my father was fortunate, you know, he never showed anything like this. I have had dealings with people in his position, and, you know, they still shake, you know, when the helicopter flies overhead because they think they're back in Vietnam, you know. So he may have been, on our side of it, he may have been, well, he was very fortunate.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just wondering, it's just as a little aside, your first book was about, got that, Captain Allen. I just wondered why you chose to write about him and not your dad first. Or was it not a conscious decision?
No, well, although I've been written a lot, it's usually been magazine style. I've never, thank God, been driven to write the great Australian novel. The always been interested in aviation as a spin-off of military history. And in London in 28, waiting for the birth of granddaughter, my wife let me go to the Royal Air Force Museum for half a day. And here was the plane of Alec Little, a 1916 aircraft, somehow survived, on which he'd had his first combat. And all of a sudden, here he was. I never heard of him. He shot down 47 enemy aircraft. He's an Australian, right up there with the Red Baron and all the others. And how come that I hadn't heard of him when I should have? And that got me into writing it and researching it, because he was a kid who left Scots College at 15, paid his own way to the war, joined the Brits, of course, because we didn't have much of an air force. Did astonishing things. You wouldn't put him in a comic. And I sort of felt he deserved his belated place in the sun, because he was killed in 1918. And unlike Kingston Smith and all the other great heroes, you know, he didn't become a figure of admiration for generations. He was a very young man who did astonishing things, and like a meteor, up, down, bang, gone. So that appealed to me. And of course, also in retirement, had some time. Now, with father, late last year, I was dusting off the albums, and this is the main album, and realised, of course, it was the 80th anniversary in 2021, and that while I had left the War Memorial copy some of the pictures, there were a lot in there that otherwise would probably finish up, if not in a tip, you know, in some grandchild's cupboard, and not knowing the background. So I went to the publisher, and he challenged me to write something about it. I did. I found Harry Fraser to speak for all of them. I had the history to flesh it out, and finished up with a book, which of course is a salute particularly to him and his colleagues and that whole generation that gave up so much. So that's why I did the second book. It was a question of timing, and the fact that most of he died, of course, in 1981, and there were only a handful of rats left. And if it was ever to be done, and me, because I've done family history, it was me or nobody. So that was the genesis of the book.
It is very interesting when you're researching certain topics, and I know through this project I've certainly discovered things that I had no idea about. So when you were researching your father's details, did you find out much about his experience that you weren't aware of prior to that?
Not very much. My brother Jerry and I had done a massive family history initially 35 years ago, and more recently updated with Trove, you know, the famous Trove search engine, and we'd published it. And we were Gold Rush German, so we had all that background. So that was there. When I did this book, for the first time, I wrote away and got his army file. And that had one interesting thing we weren't sure of. He in the end, right at the end of the war, he had actually rejoined the battalion because he'd been training troops when they fought in Borneo at Tarakan. So they actually had been to the islands, which is something of interest. Although he didn't fight there, he was what they call left out of battle. These were the senior guys they left behind to reshape the battalion if it had been knocked around. There was only one marvellous, ironic thing amongst the details. He survived the Germans, the Italians, the desert, the jungle, presumably the risk of Japanese fire. And he was, when the end of the war came, he was rather uncomfortable, and he was invalided home to Australia only 2 weeks after the war finished, ahead of everyone else, with hemorrhoids, piles. So he'd finished. Who was it? T.S. Eliot, the world ends not with a bang, but with a whimper. Well, his war ended with a pain in the arse. Terrible irony when you look at everything else he dodged.
achieved. I'm sure he would have liked a different ending than that.
Well, he was probably glad to get home because I was born in 43, so by the time he got back, I would have been 2-year-old. And wondering who this strange man was, I guess.
Yes, there would have been a lot of children in that era that were in the same boat.
Oh,
Now
I feel very, very lucky sometimes.
Yes. Yeah, sorry.
Well,
sorry.
You know, the guilt of the survivor, you know, I mean, I was born when he got back, and all those tens of thousands who never came back. It's very, very hard sometimes.
Absolutely. Now, your father did bring a trinket home from war. I believe you have it there, and you might be able to tell us the story of that.
He as kids do, and I remember I was the oldest of 6, you know, we'd sneak into the big chest of drawers, and all this military stuff was in there. Fantastic zipped map case, you know, with the map of Tobruk in it with his handwriting and stuff like this, and his medals, and a lot of clothing and belts and boots and khaki, this and that, his tin helmet. And right down the bottom one day, we discovered a bloody great 45 revolver and bullets. And when we were teenagers, we actually sneaked it out and went up the bush with some friends and tried to hit the lid of a 44-gallon drum from about 10 feet away and missed. And we put it back and we never saw it again. I suspect he may have had a faint smell of cordite and realised it had been borrowed and it had gone. And okay, so there's all that memorabilia and nothing of that survives, unhappily, not the form of military stuff. But the only thing on display in the house to remind visitors of what had happened was this ashtray from the famous Shepherd's Hotel in Cairo. It's like the Windsor of Cairo. During the war, it was for officers only. So he obviously knocked off a very gaudy relic. And that was on the mantelpiece. And when the friends used to come and play cards, you know, the little smoke said out it would come. So that was the only visible relic of his, of these years. And certainly he didn't race out on Anzac Day that I can ever remember and, carry on like that with the boys.
No, but that is a bit of an Aussie thing to do, isn't it, really?
Oh, well,
Nick the ashtray,
he was very good.
Nick the ashtray from the pub.
He was, that's right. Yes, he very much a man's man, but he smoked, and that's what killed him in the end. And 40 years exactly after the fighting, that was his only vice, you know, the ciggies. And of course, in those days, they weren't so reviled, and you didn't realise what you were getting into. So, yeah. Well, a good man, and we were very lucky we had him that long, really, and he saw his grandkids briefly, and that was that.
Well, that's lovely. Now, I would like to ask you to read another passage from your book if you had a moment to do so.
Okay. This was written barely 2 weeks after what they call the May Battle, where the battalion lost almost half its men in resisting Rommel and, in fact, blunting his attack so much that by the time he forced his way past, the British guns managed to stop his tanks. So here he is. May 19, we had a very fierce day on Saturday. It's a big strain here. We're all hoping we'll get some relief, as most of us have been fighting now for 6 weeks. I've had some very hard shocks lately, pals and mates, etc., of which you would hear more anon. We're all heartily sick of this business and badly need a spell out of it altogether. This is a war of nerves with shelling and dive bombing. I've seen a few bad cases of shell shock. It's a wonder I haven't been myself at times. It's been that close. I've had 2 encounters at close quarters with Jerry, the Germans, and his infantry is not a patch on ours without mechanised support. It's surprising how afraid one can be before an engagement. And then when he gets into it, he seems to lose all fear. That's my experience anyway. But oh, Mother, it's horrible, this warfare. I've seen some horrible sights. I feel very sad at the moment. I want to forget it all. But it'll be a day or two before we're out of this yet. We're constantly on guard here, of course, night and day. So later on, he was able to talk about the rest of the siege was mainly boredom. You know, the fighting was a relatively brief part, and after that it was boredom and patrolling and occasional injuries.
Yes, it's a little bit heart-wrenching actually hearing those sorts of words come from a young man.
So he's right. The heat is very dry and clear, very similar to the clear heat in Swan Hill. The difference being that there is absolutely no shade whatsoever, only what you make yourself. And it's like an oven in there, to say nothing of the flies. The nights here are glorious though, delightfully cool and bright, and easily the most beautiful nights I've ever seen. Just made for walking out or parking on a nice green lawn, because he said he hadn't seen anything green for 6 months. So look, that's just a few snapshots.
Well, thank you for reading. Thank you for reading that. So, Mike, what's the future hold for you? Have you got another book in you? Do you feel that you might keep writing?
It'd have to be pretty compelling to, I don't want to write about Nick Kelly or Phar Lap or cricket or anything, but just as I found the pilot, and I found, of course, in my own library, something to write about my father and his generation, it'd have to be pretty good. My wife hopes I will. Once we get through this pandemic, who knows?
Yes, yes. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. But my final question to you is this. Now, I know that you had a pub in Nattermuck as in the family going back a couple of generations. So, and it turned out that your father's birthday would ultimately become Australia Day. So that's quite auspicious, isn't it, with that? Now, I'm just wondering if your dad, who didn't mind a small sherry and probably after the war didn't mind a scotch, and that's fair enough too, I think, if he was sitting at the pub, Lewis's pub, on Australia Day, having a small tipple, what do you think he'd make of the world and the current times we're in now?
Well, after surviving the suicide of his father in the bush and the depression and the worst war the world had ever seen, I think he'd be a bit surprised at the fuss some people are making about minor things happening in this scene we're in. He was a great man for fair play. He taught us all that. And he would be very upset with the selfishness of those people who are not listening to the pleas of the medics to do the 4 famous things to avoid the disease. He'd be very upset by that, but he also understood human nature. But he'd probably like to go and kick a bum, I think, if he found someone not cheering, jesting about not wearing masks. So, and of course, he may have had vague memories. He was born in 17. He would have had vague childhood memories of the dreadful Spanish influenza, which killed, 12,000 Australians. So that may have been in his past as well, and he therefore knew that there were prices to be paid if people were careless.
Yes, a good note good note to close on there, Mike. Now,
Okay.
a rat of Tobruk, Diggers' Lost Images of the Siege will be available to borrow through the library as soon as we reopen. Obviously, currently we're closed at the moment, or we might be open by the time this airs. Fingers crossed. We hope we will be. So on behalf of the library, Mike, thank you for taking the time to talk to us tonight and share your father's story. I do recommend that people certainly borrow your book through us. I thoroughly enjoyed it. My manager read it, she enjoyed it, sent it on to her father. We've had this whole procession of people reading it. So, and of course, yes, absolutely. So we do recommend that if you can't loan it from the library, please do. Please do go and purchase the book. Now, I'm just going to finish with that Mike has kindly offered to answer questions for people. So if you would like to ask Mike anything about his book, please feel free to pop them in the comments. Pop your questions in the comments below and Mike will be available to answer them. So once again, thank you to Mike for joining us this evening. Please take the opportunity to view the trailer of the Swan Hill Remembers film, there is a link on this post, and the full film can be viewed on the Swan Hill Regional Library YouTube channel after today. And if anyone would like to purchase a DVD of the film, please contact the library for an order, and we will certainly endeavour to get them to you later in the year. Also, our online exhibition of World War II memorabilia is also available for viewing now, and there is a link again in the event post. So we certainly hope that you enjoy our Swan Hill Remembers project, and thank you for watching.